This is the video for Unit 2, which is about applications to current issues and research methods in medical anthropology. In the Unit 1 video, I really focused on the topics and theories of medical anthropology, trying to give you a sense of sort of the kinds of inquiries that medical anthropologists conduct. And in this video, I want to talk about a couple of issues that I think complement that first video. The first is how some of those theories are really applicable to analyzing contemporary health issues. So we'll talk a little bit about really how the practical application of a medical anthropological approach, what that looks like. And then the second thing I'd like to do in this video is talk a bit about research methods in cultural anthropology and more specifically in medical anthropology. That is how medical anthropologists go about collecting information in the first place. So those are the two things that we'll be discussing in this video. For example, you read Horton's piece, which is about healthcare in the U.S. And this is really a critique of the Affordable Care Act that was enacted some years ago. And thinking about what an anthropologist can bring to thinking about a modern healthcare system. And one of the things that Horton talks about in here is some of the assumptions that are embedded in the ACA and why it might be important to unpack and even resist some of those assumptions. Okay, so one of those assumptions is the nature of how we think about health and responsibilities for health. So there's a contrast between the notion of health as a human right versus health as something that is basically an individual responsibility and something that the individual pursues through their consumer choices, right? So Horton wants to encourage us to think about ways to enact health as a human right and to resist this notion that health should primarily be understood as an individual responsibility in the context of our public health system. So the difference then is the responsibility, putting the responsibility for health in a particular society on the state versus on corporations, right? Or various kinds of medical institutions. The ACA, of course, was responding to the high rates of medically uninsured or underinsured people in the U.S. population. And the tremendous burden that is, both on individuals who cannot get the care that they need and on the health system in general, right? As people are simply not able to draw on resources in a way that makes sense. So what Horton is really trying to tell us here is that medical anthropologists have something distinctive to bring to discussions about U.S. health policy or national level health policies. And what are those things? One of them is that anthropologists work at the micro level, right? The ethnographic process is about working with people in their communities, in their homes, right? So being able to document social processes at that grassroots or micro level allows anthropologists a sort of bottom-up view of a system like the U.S. healthcare public health system, which is more usually addressed from the top down, right? So this is a much needed sort of complement to those more institutional kinds of analyses of something like public health. Another thing that medical anthropologists bring to this kind of discussion is unpacking or denaturalizing key concepts. Sort of in the same way that we were just talking about with Locke's idea of local biologies. One of the things that anthropologists are good at is starting with what are often taken for granted concepts, fundamental sort of elements that people have ceased to even question. And anthropologists are good at sort of actually questioning that, unpacking it, critiquing it, and often finding that there's a whole bunch of assumptions embedded in those concepts that have directed the conversation in a particular way, right? So not assuming that those key concepts need to be understood in those ways. And the other key thing that medical anthropologists can bring to a critique of public health is is bringing in a sort of political economic critique, okay? That is not assuming that sort of market-based medicine, right, which is the standard in the US, that we need to start from that, but thinking more broadly about how politics and economics inform health and healthcare, and how we might, again, think more creatively about other ways to organize public health in the US and elsewhere. Another piece that you read that I think also speaks to this question of how anthropology can be relevant to contemporary issues is Lee's piece, which is about the rise of what are called direct-to-consumer genetics. It's the services like 23andMe, for example, where you, and some of you may have done this at some point or known people who've done it, where you basically spit in a tube and send a sample of your DNA to this company and they do a genetic profile, which can tell you things about a variety of aspects, including things like your heritage, but can also give you a sort of genetic profile of your health status, right? So, for example, if you have any markers that would predispose you for certain diseases, etc., right? So the rise of this direct-to-consumer genetics, Lee suggests, represents a real shift in the relationship that everyday people have to genetic research and in how we think about health and illness. And there's a few elements to this shift, as she describes it. So one is a shift from people conceptualizing themselves as a patient, right, typically in relationship to a doctor, and instead now people conceptualizing themselves as consumers, right? So instead of taking your health concerns or your interest in knowing more about the genetics of your health to a physician, you buy this service from 23andMe. You stop being a patient and started being a consumer. Likewise, it's a move from something like this being considered a medical procedure to it being considered self-care, right? It's part of what you do to sort of maintain your own wellness, but it's on you, right? It's also shifting that responsibility. So from institutional control, such as the medical establishment, right, going to a clinic, seeing your doctor, going to a hospital, to individual control, and also from the medical establishment to the marketplace. So again, something that used to be a transaction or an exchange between a patient and doctor is now an exchange between a consumer and a corporation. And then this is also shifting from sort of the medical interest in protecting you from future disease to something, again, that's framed in terms of choice. Lee also talks about this shift in relationship to the deeper history of public connections to or public understandings of genetics research, which has changed considerably over time. So if you look at the sort of the history of genetics, and again, as it relates to the public over the last 100+ years, there are some key phases that it goes through. In the early 20th century and through World War II, we see the significance of the movement called eugenics. Some of you may have read about this in history classes and other contexts. Eugenics was an approach to the relationship between human variation and political power that was very significant, had a lot of power in, again, the first half of the 20th century. It was the sort of perspective or framework that inspired and was used by the Nazi movement in Germany. It also was very powerful here in the United States, and it was the basis for many kinds of racist thinking and policy during that era, because it took physical variation and different kinds of genetic profiles and connected them to hierarchies of social value. So a troubling sort of approach to human variation, but one that it's important to know about because of the power that it had in the first half of the 20th century. After World War II, Lee reminds us, the use of sort of genetic information or thinking about genetic variability fell under a sort of paradigm of protection, right? That is, knowing what people are predisposed to in terms of health and illness in order to plan for and work preventatively around health issues. The more recent sort of paradigm, the one that accompanies the rise of 23andMe and other of these sort of direct-to-consumer genetics products, is a paradigm of access and the right to know, right? So one of the things she's suggesting is this move to the 23andMe model is a shift of health, a shift to health as an individual responsibility, an aspect of what you are expected to know about yourself and act on by yourself, right? So it's no longer enough to, maintain your visits to your doctor's office to know about the status of your health. But now you're expected to access your genetic information to know what your status is. So this idea of putting sort of the individual consumer as the primary site of health practice is, she suggests, a new development in the last 20 years or so. And it is accompanied by new subjectivities or new ways of sort of imagining oneself and one's relationship to the rest of society and to the public health infrastructure. So now the self is understood as a project that you are in charge of, and that tools like 23andMe are at your disposal for you to manage and work on that project to the best of your ability. This is, she suggests, sort of the new cultural model of health in the era of direct-to-consumer genetics. Okay, I want to transition now from talking about these contemporary issues and applications of medical anthropology to talking about research methods, starting really more broadly with just cultural anthropology in general. But medical anthropologists are cultural anthropologists. So, it's really the same techniques. But I think it's important to understand, not only what the products of medical anthropologists' research are, but also how they got there, right? Like, what are the actual things you do when you're doing ethnographic field work that allow you to compile information that you're then in a position to analyze? So for the remainder of the lecture, then we're going to talk about research methods in cultural anthropology, and then in particular interviewing. So let's go ahead and do that. So cultural anthropology is a qualitative social science. What that means is that cultural anthropologists, and again in this course we're focusing on medical anthropologists as a subset of cultural anthropologists. What it means is that we're interested in social patterns and social phenomena, right? More generally, we're interested in culture and how it operates. And that to understand that, we use interpretive methods, right? So qualitative methods are those typically that rely on, one way to think about it is that rely on listening to people's stories and looking for the patterns across those stories in order to understand a social or cultural world. The primary set of techniques that we use to uncover those stories and those experiences is what is referred to as the ethnographic method. And indeed, you read in the Mosher article that you're reading in this unit quite a bit about that ethnographic approach. And so hopefully from reading that, you learned a little bit about both how anthropologists do ethnographic work and some of the challenges of it, right? So the ethnographic method involves a researcher embedding themselves in the social context that they want to learn about. So in other words, unlike some other social sciences, Anthropologists don't, for example, invite people into a lab setting in order to understand how they live or what they think about. Instead, the ethnographer goes to the people that they want to learn from, and joins that social world. So anthropologists typically spend long periods of time, right? Meaning a year or 2 years, sometimes 5 more years, right? Living in that community and learning from people. So what that means is it's both about being present in that social space, and it's also about participating in daily life and learning by doing things yourself, right, alongside the people that you are there to learn about. One of the things that this does for the researcher is to provide what I'm calling here backstage access. What I mean by that is anthropologists, of course, like other social scientists, use formal research methods to collect information. We're going to talk about a couple of those in a minute. So, for example, one thing that cultural anthropologists often do is to conduct interviews, right? Which is where you formally sit down with someone, you ask them a set of questions that you've composed because you think they're a good way to get at the information you want, and you record that conversation in some way, and then you do a whole bunch of those, and then you analyze the results, right? So anthropologists do that, but given the nature of ethnographic research, anthropologists are also just around when things happen. So this is that sort of idea of a backstage access. So it's not just those formal moments of research activity, but it's all the little things that happen in the day-to-day of living with people and around people 24/7 for an extended period. And those sort of little incidental things that the anthropologist experiences become quite important for understanding that social world. And it leads to the anthropologist being able to provide what is sometimes referred to as a thick description. This is a phrase you'll hear a lot in discussions of ethnographic practices by cultural anthropologists. And it's a phrase that was coined by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz. And what it means is that long-term experience, day after day, seeing people doing certain kinds of things over and over and over, allows for the anthropologist to accrue a lot of experience and understanding of something. And that leads them to be able to provide this kind of thick description, right? Which means that it's a description of social life that is born of long-term cumulative experience, observation, and therefore has some sort of depth to it. Right, so it's the repeated long-term interaction with people in a particular social world that leads to the ability to provide that sort of rigorous presentation and analysis of what that world is like. Some other qualities of the ethnographic method are that this is a process that is subjective, interpretive, and reflexive. I want to take a minute to unpack these terms. A lot of times I think there's an assumption that saying that research is subjective is a bad thing, right? As particularly in the context of Western culture, we're often trained to believe that objective is better than subjective. Cultural anthropologists want to challenge that notion. And suggest that, in fact, in the context of trying to understand people and how they live, that trying to take some kind of objective approach is probably impossible and may, in fact, do a disservice to actually understanding what people are like. So in the sense of doing anthropology, the idea of it being subjective is that we as researchers are also enculturated human beings. So almost by definition, when we go into a field site to try to learn about people's social lives, we are engaging not as some kind of objective machine, but as subjective fellow human beings. And that indeed being able to connect with our fellow human beings in the field site is part of what allows us to understand what's happening there. right? So in other words, we are not just neutral and outside of the frame of the social world we're trying to describe. We are part of it, right? And that is, where this idea of reflexivity comes from. You'll often hear this term as well, that anthropology is reflexive as a practice. And what it means is that cultural anthropologists make a point of recognizing that their presence in the field site informs what happens there. The Mosher article, for example, suggests that ethnographic research is collaborative between the researcher and the people in the field site that the researcher is trying to learn about, right? So in other words, the anthropologist doesn't go in and sort of single-handedly create knowledge, but instead it's precisely through interactions, it's through those interpersonal exchanges that the knowledge of the ethnographic project comes into focus. So again, anthropologists have recognized that and make it not a problem, right, or a liability, but actually part of how to successfully conduct research in this way. Okay, so that's sort of the backdrop or the overview of an ethnographic approach to doing research. Now, within that, as I mentioned before, anthropologists are using specific techniques, and those techniques are what we call research methods. A few of the main ones that cultural anthropologists use are interviews, observation, archival research, genealogies, and film and photography. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some key techniques that are used. Let's start with interviews. Interviews, which I'm sure many of you have done an interview at some point, and even if you haven't, interviews are simply conversations between two people. And conversations, one way I think of it is sort of a conversation with an agenda. So the person doing the interview has an interest in learning very specific things from the person they're asking questions of, right? But it is in many ways very much like other conversations, right? In all conversations, typically, people ask each other questions and listen to the answers, right? So interviews are not radically different than other kinds of conversations you've had, but they are different in the sense that you, the interviewer, are going to be much more purposeful about what you ask and about how you record what you hear in response to those questions than you would in just a casual conversation, okay? Let's start with some categories, different kinds of interviews. Interviews can be either structured or unstructured. The interviews you'll be doing for this course are going to be unstructured, but I wanted to give you a sense of both varieties so you know how to compare them. So a structured interview is one in which the researcher is going to carefully craft a list of questions and ask them of each interview subject in precisely the same way, right, using the same phrasing in the same order, and try to be as consistent as possible from one interview to the next. The idea with structured interviews is that you are looking for something that will allow you to be comparative across a relatively large pool of interviewees. An unstructured interview, on the other hand, is one in which you will still go in with a list of questions that you've composed in advance, but you will let the conversation go where it leads a bit more than you would in a structured context. In other words, if you ask your interviewee a question and it leads you to think of a follow-up that wasn't on your script, you will go ahead and follow that line of questioning and you will ask that follow-up question. Or if you need to add some other kind of prompt along the way, you will also do that, right? So the idea with an unstructured interview is that it's got a looser sort of format, one in which you can let what emerges in the conversation inform the direction that the conversation takes, and one in which the interviewer is, to some extent, following the lead of the interviewee, right? You're letting that person guide you to what is the most important information. One of the things that that means, of course, is that one unstructured interview will always be somewhat different than the next, right? They're not going to be completely consistent. But again, in the context of this kind of research, that's not necessarily a problem. If you were not planning to do some kind of statistical analysis of the findings from your interviews, it may not matter that they're all somewhat different, because what you're looking for, again, is that thick description. You're looking for going deeply into the experience of all these individuals, not trying to get consistent data across a large population. Okay. The second set of categories that I'll mention is, in addition to this idea of interviews being either structured or unstructured, there are also some particular kinds of interviews, and some of which might be quite useful for some of the projects you'll be doing in this course. So, for example, in the field of medical anthropology, illness history interviews are an important technique, which is where you're going to interview somebody basically about the trajectory of an illness experience, right? Like, when did you first start to feel ill? What happened? You know, did you go to a doctor? What did they say, right? So sort of taking the history of that illness and thinking of it as a sort of timeline, right? Or another variety of interview is a life history interview. That's where you're really looking to try to get sort of the story of someone's life. Starting, you can go all the way back to the beginning and have people tell you, about everything, or you can take a sort of a certain part of their life, right? Tell me about your early career and what happened then, right? But again, that idea, these sort of history interviews, the idea is to try to pull out a sequence, right? And through questions and prompts, try to ask your interviewee to fill in the details of a sequence of events and experiences. Now, in any of these kinds of interview, the heart of what an interview is a series of questions, right? So regardless of which kind of interview you plan to do, one of the things the interviewer is going to absolutely need to do is to compose a series of questions to pose, okay? There are lots of ways to go about writing questions, and I did just want to give you a few examples just to get the wheels turning when you start writing questions of your own. And this is from an anthropologist named Jorgensen, who sort of came up with a guide for writing interview questions and provides some examples. So here are a few examples of kinds of interview questions that might be useful for you. One kind of interview question is what Jorgensen refers to as a tour question. And what he means by that is that one way to ask people for information is to ask them to give you sort of an overview of something. So when you call it a tour question, it's the idea of sort of, if you said to someone, walk me through, I don't know, a day on your job, right? Or walk me through your, experiences with X, Y, or Z. So it's a good, perhaps, initial kind of question when you're first starting an interview or you're first learning about a topic, to ask people, in other words, instead of zeroing in on asking them one specific thing, ask the interviewee to lead you through the subject. So that you're letting the person you want to learn from sort of point out to you what the main things are that you should be aware of, right? So it's a good thing, again, to use when you are new to the subject. So you don't want to go in there assuming that you know what the most important thing is. Instead, you're going to say to the person, walk me through, your field or your attitude about X, Y, or Z, and then they can point out the main features to you. Okay, so that's one kind, a tour question. Another kind is an example question. And this can either be a standalone question, or it can also be a really good follow-up question. So, for example, if you ask somebody a question and you get maybe a vague or an abstract answer, it can be a good idea to use a follow-up question that's an example question. So you say, oh, okay, great, thanks for saying that, and can you give me an example of that? So in other words, you're kind of asking people to give you one instance of something to make it more concrete, or to clarify, or to illustrate a response. Another kind of question is an experience question. And this, again, sort of works, it can also work well in that same kind of context where somebody gives you sort of an abstract answer and you want something a little bit more concrete. This is to ask people about direct experience, actual things, right? So you're going to ask them, what happened, on that day, or, what did you say to the person, right? So you're asking people to report on specific things, not to give you general answers in the abstract. Another kind is a significance question. So again, as a follow-up, if somebody reports something about their life to you, you may want to ask them about the significance. So you could ask them, about how they felt about something, or what did that mean to you? What did you think about that, right? So you're asking people not only for what they've done or had happened to them, but how they actually felt about it and how they interpreted it. So you're asking people essentially with that kind of a significance question to do a little mini analysis of their own experience for you. And a final kind that I'll throw out here is a native language question. And this can be a really useful kind of question if you are doing interviews in a second language, for example. But it can also be really useful even if you and the interviewee are both speaking your first language, right? So it can be an opportunity to ask people to unpack particular words or phrases that they use, particularly if those words or phrases seem really important, like they're important concepts, right? So if you're speaking to someone and they use a word that's like jargon from their work or their hobby, right? And it seems important to understanding that work or hobby, you might ask them to break down that term for you, right? So you'd say like, oh, you use this word, can you explain to me what that word means, right? Even if you have a sense, like a general sense of what the word means, asking somebody who's an expert and an insider to clarify it for you can often yield important insights, okay? So it's really just, if somebody uses a word or a phrase, you stop and say like, oh, hey, you use this phrase. Can you tell me more about what that means and what that means to you? Okay? So again, this is not an exhaustive list. It doesn't mean that you can only write questions in these ways. It's more like to give you some examples and some suggestions for some of the ways that you might think about writing questions. Now, obviously, when we're having these kinds of conversations that are interviews, unlike a casual conversation, which, you have conversations all day long, you have a vested interest in capturing the information that is revealed during those interviews, right? And for the most part, it's too hard to just remember it. So you're going to need to record it in some way, because you're going to want to be able to remember it later on and write about it, okay? So don't just rely on your memory. Memory is usually not good enough to capture all those details. So there's a few different ways to do it. And these are three that I mentioned here. You can take notes during the interview, literally write or type during the interview. That's a fine way to capture that information. The challenge of it, as you can imagine, is trying to write or type while you're also listening and talking is kind of hard, right? So you're going to have to work at that technique, right? You've all done it when you've done things like even like taking notes during a lecture in a class, right? It's the same idea. Like you're trying to listen to what's happening and also, think about it and then also write it down. Some people find it challenging to try to write and still be present enough to ask the next question. But it's a great technique, so it's worth trying.
You can also wait until after the interview to take notes. This one you have to rely on your memory a little bit more, but if you take the notes after the interview sort of as soon as possible, like literally right after the interview, you'll be able to remember quite a lot. If you leave it for too long, like if you don't write it down until the next day, you will have forgotten a lot more. So that one, if you're going to wait, if you're going to be present in the conversation and then write the notes afterwards, try to do it as quickly as possible. And then, of course, sort of maybe the most obvious thing to do is just to record it, right? Use your phone or whatever else. And that is, of course, great. You get a complete record. The challenge with this one is you need to then go back and listen to the recording and either take notes or transcribe it, which is also great because you have a ton of information then. It's just kind of labor intensive, right? So usually a good idea, I think, is to do two of these, right? To pair them. So something like digitally recording the interview, but also take a few notes during the interview so that when you're done, you don't have to go back to listen to the whole recording to understand anything. You already have a few notes, you know the gist of it, and then you can also go back to the recording to get the details if you need more, okay? So think about these three techniques, and again, my suggestion is to use any two of these at the same time to make sure you capture what goes on in an interview.
Okay, I'll go ahead and end the lecture there, and we will talk again soon.